pleased to be joined today by Hunter Hastings. Hunter is the host of the Economics for Entrepreneurs podcast on the Mises Institute network. Hunter, we've been talking about doing this for a while, so thank you very much for coming in. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. It's delightful to be here. Thank you.
I met you, I think it was maybe 2 years now, or maybe even 3 years now, at a Mises Circle here in San Diego, which you helped bring, I think, to the city. It was a great fortune for me because I just come from Houston, where they were having a traditional thing. They hadn't had one here in a while, I think, and I was, lucky me. I came here, not only attended that conference, but met you. And now you do a podcast for the Mises Institute. So tell us about Economics for Entrepreneurs. What is this podcast about?
Well, thank you for inviting me. You're a great presenter at our Mises Circle in San Diego, and it's been great getting to know you since then. So thank you. The Economics for Entrepreneurs podcast is a project. Okay. And it's a project whereby we're trying to increase the awareness and the popularity of Austrian economics. And we're trying to do it by appealing to a business audience. That's where the entrepreneurship part comes in. And to demonstrate that it's the most powerful tool for business success that any business could have. And we understand the role of the entrepreneur in the economy through Austrian economics. But there are a lot of principles of Austrian economics which, if we can provide business people with tools and mechanisms to apply them, will provide great support for their success. So the goal is to increase popularity of Austrian economics by making entrepreneurs successful.
I think a lot of entrepreneurs, or at least the successful ones, or successful business people, they have sort of this, I don't know if it's innate, but they have an appreciation through experience or their wiring for a lot of the things that Austrian economics would teach them. But they have that through sort of experience, trial and error, that sort of thing. How have you found, have they been receptive to sort of the messaging in a more formal way? Is that something that's resonated with them?
Yes, very much so. We get a lot of feedback that the tools that we talk about are useful, the principles are useful. So that kind of trial and error that you talk about is Austrian entrepreneurship, because we recognize that the future is unknowable. Mm-hmm. Value is subjective. It's in the mind of the customer. And so the entrepreneur has to figure that out, has to create a value offering that might be felt to be valued by the customer, take that to market and find out whether the customer doesn't indeed feel value. So I'll give you an example of one of the mechanisms we've talked about recently. It was with a young professor from University of Nevada in Reno, and we called it the value learning process. And it breaks down the idea of subjective value into 5 stages, which you can map out and track as an entrepreneur. So just to go through them quickly, the customer has to anticipate value, has to decide if they're going to exchange for that value, make the exchange, spend the money, experience the value, and then assess it afterwards. Did the experience meet up to that anticipation? And if you know that process, you can embed tools at every step, which we've talked about with Mark. And so an entrepreneur can go through that process and become more successful at going through it.
Now, some people in the audience won't know what you mean by subjective value. So let's back up and just explain what that is quickly.
Right. So that's another one of the great insights of Austrian economics. If the role of the entrepreneur is to create value, which means that a customer, whether that's a consumer or a B2B customer, is willing to spend money to buy that offering from the entrepreneur, that's the sense of value. And I use the word sense deliberately because value is a feeling. It's not an economic calculation, it's a feeling. Yes, if I part with my $12.97 or $10,000 a month subscription to that software, I feel like I'm going to get value. And so subjective value is in the mind of the customer, and therefore Austrian economics will help you with the creation of that sense of value and also the psychology of it. How am I going to make the promise in a way that the the customer will feel there's going to be value, and then keep that promise so that their experience is positive.
So, and let's pivot a little bit to your background, because you're not a novice at this. You worked in marketing for a very long time. So can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Yeah, marketing was my professional track. I actually have a master's degree in economics of the worst possible kind. I got it from Cambridge in the UK, and that's the epicenter of Keynesianism. I never heard the name Mises or Hayek or anything Austrian back then. But I took a job with Procter & Gamble in the UK, and I was in the marketing department. And that was a very intensely valuable experience. Procter has a very fixed process for marketing that starts with the customer. So in Austrian economics, we talk about customer sovereignty, which is one of those principles.
Yeah.
When I was at Procter & Gamble, we said the consumer is boss.
Mm-hmm.
And my consumer is mom. I was selling Tide detergent.
Oh, okay.
But the way that you do that is get to know mom intimately. What is it that mom wants? What is value for mom? And she's not just laundering clothes. She's bringing up kids. She's sending them to school. She's thinking about what her neighbor thinks of her and how her kids are dressed and things like that. So you get deeply into the psychology of mom, and then you turn out products that will meet that psychological need, that subjective value.
Yeah.
In the meantime, all of your competitors at Colgate, Palmolive, and Unilever, and so on like that, are trying to do the same thing. So the competitiveness in the market is intense, and so that was great learning. And then I advanced from there to go into the consulting business, which I say a bit satirically now is reselling Procter & Gamble's intellectual property. That's what consultants do. You see if that methodology, that process, is applicable in other industries to other consumers, but always with that idea the customer is the boss, and then all of your processes are built around that.
Yeah.
So eventually I became an entrepreneur with my own consulting and market research company. And then lo and behold, one day, this is ancient history now, but back in the 1990s, just before the dot-com boom, P&G called up, and I became CEO of a Silicon Valley startup that was trying to take Procter & Gamble's marketing processes, which were in 3-ring binders mostly, and turn it into software. How could you build process software for marketing? And then they took that inside, and Procter & Gamble, after the dot-com blow-up,
I see.
I expanded my consulting company and worked with other global marketers to do that, bring technology and metrics and process automation to marketing.
That's very interesting. I just trying to imagine what some of those meetings or brainstorming sessions must have looked like in the early days of Tide. Because now that I'm a parent and I'm married and I hear the things my wife complains about, and in retrospect, I think about those are all the things that Tide offers to solve. She was complaining about how the kids' laundry smells. It smells so horrible. Oh, there's stains, grass stains, blood stains, this and that.
Right.
And this is like regular dialogue probably at Tide headquarters.
Well, absolutely. It's what we talked about. Perfume is intensely important. So you think it's about whitening and colors and so on, but how the detergent smells and then the kids' clothes smell, that's a very important factor. Understanding why that's the case is really tricky. So
yeah, and it changes because you got out, or maybe you didn't, I don't know when you got out, but relative to this phenomenon of sort of chemical free, you know what I mean? Like, what words do they use on the packaging now? Perfume free, impurity free, or this free, that free.
Organic.
Yeah. And sort of, and what it often boils down to is removing the agent that did the work. That actually got you what you wanted.
Well, it's still chemicals, but it's an alternative form of chemical, right?
Right. Were you still in the game when that started to happen?
Actually, I was in the era of the chemical buildup. We're trying to make the chemicals more and more powerful. So my big innovation was what they called back then biological detergent. So there were certain stains that were resistant to traditional detergents, like blood, for example.
Yeah.
We found an agent that would remove those kinds of stains, so we called them biological detergents, and that was the big innovation. But the point about that is continuous innovation, always making it better. How can we make life better for mom?
Right.
And back then I was taking more stains out. Today it would be less harmful chemicals in the water and things like that, but it's always making life better for mom or your customer, which is what Austrian economics is all about. Economics is about making life better for individuals through innovation and improvements, And the people who do that, the agents who do that in the economy, are entrepreneurs. So that's our driving force.
That's pretty central, right? Sort of the insatiable appetite of us to go higher and higher on the value scale.
Right.
And Seinfeld had a joke about, I don't know if you remember this, about Tide, P&G back in the day.
Yeah, no, I'm not familiar with Seinfeld. So.
It was very good. This is back in the 90s. He said, when he was doing stand-up, he said, Tide, they have new Tide. I mean, again? Like, it's still not good enough. Like, those poor people, they have to keep making it better. How good is good enough? Right. And the punchline was, if you've got blood on your clothes, you got a problem. You got a more serious problem than your detergent. But we do want better. New is one of the most powerful motivators that we have as in marketing, is it not?
Right. So the constant is better or new. Better, really, because that's what consumers are looking for, is improvement. The change is how you make it better. So going from more chemicals is better to less chemicals is better. It's still better.
Right.
And as you say, it's about context, it's about time, it's about what the rest of the world is thinking, because that affects how individuals are thinking as well. But you're right, the insatiable drive for betterment, that's the word that's used in economics, is what drives consumers. It's what drives civilizational advance. It's what makes the world better. It's what makes medicine better. It's what makes cars better. It's that drive. It's exhibited often as a negative, and that's one of the things that we try to get entrepreneurs to understand. And Steve Jobs was the genius at this. They can never tell you what they want. They can't tell you what is better. What they can tell you is what Mises called unease or dissatisfaction, which is, I wish this was easier, or I wish this was brighter, or I don't like that smell. So the data comes at you as negatives, and what the entrepreneur does is turn that into betterment.
Yeah, and it's not intuitive, but I totally agree with that. It's sort of hearing your customer without listening to them per se. Meaning you're hearing what their discomforts are, what their problems are, but not necessarily listening to what they tell you to do, because they're not the entrepreneur, they're the consumer. And all of this sounds good. So everything we've discussed so far, better, fewer problems, new, that all sounds good. But you must know this. When society looks at people who do advertising and marketing, so I'm sort of in that game, you were in that game, advertisers are not held in high regard by the general public. They're down there with stockbrokers and politicians and salesmen. Even though I would contend that this is a noble cause, this is a noble thing that you're doing. You're connecting, right, and driving entrepreneurs. Why do you think that is? The public has that sentiment.
Well, you're right. It's a horrible sentiment to have. It's two things. It's one, not understanding the knowledge component of value. So in order for the customer to experience value, the knowledge about what their problem is, what their solution is, and so on like that is a part of the value. And so advertising is just the knowledge part of the product or the service. And so it should be welcomed, it's value added as opposed to an extra cost. And a lot of people don't understand that. The second problem is more general, which is there's a sentiment among the anti-capitalists or the anti-commercial people that one person's gain, if somebody's successful at being an entrepreneur and selling a product and so on like that, is another person's loss. It's exploited somebody. If you've made a profit, somebody's made a loss, which is 100% wrong, and it's a horrible concept that we have to reverse somehow. But that's out there, and that's another thing that we have to eradicate.
Hold on. I mean, one person's gain can be someone else's non-gain, right? And so could it not just be that they're talking about?
No, I don't think so, because when they talk about these subjects like social entrepreneurship,
that's different.
Entrepreneurship and so on, well, they're trying to say that regular entrepreneurship is not helping society.
Yeah.
And the opposite is true. The point that we have to get across, I think, is if I'm an entrepreneur as an individual, I help you as an individual, that's one positive added value. If you roll that up, it's better for society. But no one loses at any point in time. Yes, some other people got
some
no
people will
gain
claim
out of that, but
Yeah.
they got a gain from some other entrepreneur that they interacted with.
Some people will claim, and I agree with you. This is the wrong way to look at it. That they're entitled to that business that the entrepreneur. So Gillette may feel that they're entitled to the customers that Dollar Shave Club or Harry's is taking, and I don't agree with that, but that's I think the basis of that argument, right, is an entitlement on someone else's business, entitlement to someone else's business.
Yeah, I think that's a misreading of another concept which we have to help people understand better, which is competition. So there's the image of competition. You described it as I'm entitled to their customers. There's the red in tooth and claw image of competition. And competition is just different sets of entrepreneurs trying to do better for mom. And if Harry's Shave Club did better for their group of customers, which is probably not the same as Gillette's, but let's say they overlap a little bit, then Gillette will try harder to tell that customer, hey, I've improved even more and I've got something better for you. I've got a better value, which might be a change in price. So I think that's a misunderstanding of competition, and if we can redirect that feeling about competition, that would be another benefit we could bring.
It's very easy when you put the consumer first, at least to us in this conversation. But when you talk about people who have jobs, that's when it's harder to convince people, right? Because you say, for instance, these mom and pop stores that are being driven out of business by Amazon, or maybe it was Barnes and Noble back in the day, or Walmart, or whatever. Those people had jobs. Now they don't have jobs. They have to, and you can stand back and look at it big picture wise and say, oh, well, the economy will reorganize itself. The factors of production will be optimized and everyone moves on. The problem is when you're talking about individuals who, lose jobs and, experience hardship. How do you approach that?
Well, you do approach it at the individual level. So you used a phrase there that's in the common vernacular, driven out of business. Well, we would look at it slightly different and say the customers who used to shop at that store have now decided that they get more value when they go to Walmart. So why is that? What has changed? What has caused them to believe that? And then the job of the entrepreneur is either to improve their service to their local community and their location, if they can figure out how to do that, or they may have to move if geography has moved. It's very difficult, that's correct, to make those adjustments. The job of the entrepreneur is to be adaptive, to change at the speed of the market, ideally even faster than the market. And it's very difficult, very challenging.
I guess this is sort of an explanation of how difficult it is to be an entrepreneur. This is why they should be praised, because these are the forces that they have to deal with. Go ahead.
Let me give you an example of the principle that we can teach, and if we can find the mechanisms to make it work, that'd be helpful. So, one of the principles of Austrian economics is dynamically flexible capital. The value of capital is how much revenue you get out of it from serving customers. And if that changes, if the revenue stream starts to dry up, like the example of the store, then that's a signal that you need to flexibly change that capital. So the example today is you build an internet retail store as opposed to a brick and mortar mom and pop store. Now, obviously that flexibility is very hard to achieve, but that's what's happening in the dynamism of the economy. So the entrepreneur is the person who can figure out that adaptiveness, that dynamism.
I want to go back to something we were talking about just a little bit earlier. I'm imagining you in a P&G boardroom having a meeting, and this is decades ago. And if some young kid came in hypothetically and said, I've got this app or program, this computer application that does this, and this is essentially what Facebook does. Okay, I'm going to get all of this information for you, people's personal habits, their connections, their spending patterns, geography, just everything that you could possibly want about people I have. How excited are you guys at that point? I mean, or how are you reacting to that?
Which decade do you want me to be in? I was there in the 90s.
Be in the 80s.
In the 80s
So,
and 90s.
so just when we got computers.
Yep.
So you're there with your spreadsheet thinking, this Lotus 123 is amazing. And then this kid walks in with Facebook, essentially, with all this information. What are you thinking?
We would look at it that shared information and the speed of sharing information is very, very valuable. So I started out in the UK at Procter & Gamble. A lot of decisions are made in Cincinnati, and getting stuff from UK to Cincinnati for approval took some time. There was a moment when there was a rail strike, and it was before FedEx, and Procter & Gamble started its own mail service between where we were located in London, where a lot of our suppliers and agencies were. So we understood the power of shared information and the speed of sharing and the compounding of knowledge. I'll give you another minor example. We also had a P&G alumni handbook. So everybody who's ever worked in P&G anywhere, you could find them and you could do networking, which was kind of Facebook on paper. So we would have understood the concept. I don't think you could have anticipated social networking, as the founders of Facebook also didn't anticipate the power of social networking. It evolved, and that's the other thing that you see in economics. You can't predict the future. You're not a failure if you couldn't have predicted Facebook. What you've got to do is be able to find the signals and say, hey, this change is happening at great speed. Here's how people are adopting that. So fax machines were a great example. That's when we first discovered network effects, I think, that the value of the network is the square of the number of nodules on the network. We didn't understand that early on, but eventually we did. So I think that's the lens we would have looked at it through.
But in terms of like a tactical advantage, I mean, it's a step function, isn't it? I mean, it's a game changer. Yeah, I mean, and especially at that time,
right?
It would have been quite something.
Yeah, yes, it would. But one of the big things that the digital world changed is this whole arena of marketing. So I was in the era of reach. The more eyeballs you could reach
on TV,
yeah, or on radio or something like in a print magazine, and we looked at it in this massively inefficient way, which was the funnel, right? I reached 1 million people, 100,000 people remembered what I said, and maybe 10 bought the product. It was built-in inefficiency. And then now you look at social networking and digital advertising and targeting and the ability to read the results instantly of everything that you do. That's taken a ton of inefficiency out of that business. It's wonderful. Could we have anticipated that? No, but we had the unease about the funnel. We knew that we were wasting a lot of money, so we would have looked positively on something that reduced that inefficiency.
So, but as someone who comes from that industry, how do you see the privacy concerns that people are raising?
Yeah, I don't look at it through a privacy lens, and I understand that a lot of people do, but what has happened is consumers have made a data deal. If you let me use this social network, which is so wonderful and I'm enjoying it so much, you'll pretend that you don't charge me any money, so that's great. It's nothing coming out of my credit card. I'll happily fill in all the forms that you send, and I'll register my card and so on. And I understand that you do something with that. You use it for targeted advertising. And now I'm just starting to understand that you give it to the government for surveillance. And so I'm starting to get a bit uneasy about that.
Right.
I'm starting to get dissatisfied. So it's not about privacy. It's about the deal that the customer is willing to make. So the customer's desire at the beginning of social networking and advertising is different than it is now. And so we've got to keep up with that change.
Yeah, I mean, the deal now is privacy, right? Whereas before, maybe the consumer was blissfully ignorant, and so they just went along. So it was sort of technology for free, is sort of the way a lot of people looked at it. Now it's technology and access for privacy. So that is sort of the deal now. It was, right?
I think the deal is for targeted advertising. You're sending me ads, some of which
that's what we think it is.
Some of which are really useful. Yeah, I'm not sure about you sending that data to the government. I'm not sure what the government's going to do with it. I'm not sure whether that's a bad thing or not. So I think it's too early to generalize. I think of the adaptation and the constant change in the marketplace. We as consumers will figure this out.
Hunter, so I just want to finish up getting back to your podcast. Can you tell us about, I guess, some of the more interesting discussions you've had on the show? It's a relatively new podcast, but you have had some interesting guests. So what stands out to you?
Well, what we've been trying to do in this goal of ours to make Austrian economics useful is initially rotate professors with practitioners. So the professors, some of whom you know, Per Bylund and Peter Klein and Mark Packard, who I may have mentioned, they're talking about the principles of economics and how they're applicable to business. These are all people who are teaching in business schools, by the way, and not
Right.
just in academic economic departments. So we lay that out, and then we have practitioners come in and talk about their businesses. They may or may not know about Austrian economics. Some do, some don't. So we had a guest a couple of weeks ago, John Rossman, who's a consultant, but he used to work at Amazon. He actually set up the Amazon third-party sellers platform.
Okay.
So he talks about that as a project and how that happened, but he's helped a lot of entrepreneurs to sell on Amazon in what they call a flywheel kind of mechanism. So we talked about that when we talked about the leadership principles at Amazon, which are famous. They're published. Jeff Bezos's 13 principles. I think there are more of them now. And then that's where John talked about the mechanism. Principles are fine. You need mechanisms to apply them. So we made the parallels between our Austrian economics principles and the principles of Amazon. For example, the first, I think, on the list at Amazon is customer obsession.
Yeah.
That's what Jeff Bezos calls
Yeah.
it. The customer is always first. We're always thinking about the customer. What do we know about the customer?
Right.
That's customer sovereignty in Austrian economics. So we
Yeah.
tried to make that kind of parallel. We had your friend Rick Rule on just before Christmas, and he's a very knowledgeable Austrian, and he's applied a lot of that thinking, what they call it causal realist in academia, which is really understanding what's the cause and effect mechanisms in markets. And then he applied that intensively in a very narrow niche, very profitable but very narrow niche, which is resource investing, and he knows more about that than just about anybody else. So that's the knowledge component of Austrian economics. If you know your niche, then you've got a competitive advantage. And he explained that very, very well.
Yeah. Anything else that you learned from, because what's interesting is truths are truths, right? Whether you stumble upon them in life or you study it, you read it in a book, and are enlightened that way. Is there anything you've learned from the practitioners that you struggled with, concepts that you maybe have struggled with when you were tackling them from the intellectual academic side, that someone like Rick or this other gentleman came through and sort of showed some light on it? Has that ever happened, or can you think of anything like that?
Well, one very amusing story that I heard from a fellow called Paul Tenney. Paul is a successful internet entrepreneur, technology entrepreneur, really. He's in Singapore. He's a Californian, but he moved out to Singapore because he found a good market out there. And at the end of the podcast, I asked him, well, how has Austrian economics helped? And he thought for a minute. He says, I've learned that the labor theory of value is the most horrible thing that you have to contend with when you're managing people. They think if they work harder, that makes them more valuable. And we've got to teach them subjective value. Only the customer's opinion matters. And if you worked really hard and stayed long hours and didn't please the customer, then you haven't created any value. So he equated that to the labor theory of value,
good.
which I think is pretty practical.
Yeah.
So one of the things I've been taught by my listeners to do is I tend to talk about consumers all the time, and we think about the end consumer. But a lot of small businesses, which is the core of our target, are B2B. The customer is who you're trying to please, which all the principles still apply, but we've got to always translate what we're talking about to pleasing the customer. And that's an important thing to remember all the time, that we're in the the middle of the Hayekian triangle in theory, but it's about pleasing customers if you're a small
And
B2B vendor.
if you're in that situation and you're selling in that situation, it is still useful, right, to sell with the customer in mind, because your customer will appreciate that. If you're telling them that you can help them serve their customer better, they'll get that.
Oh yeah, and it's the difference is that it's still individual. You've still got to sell to an individual customer, know that customer, know what their sentiment is, know what their subjective value is. Part of the realism of understanding their life is they're living in an organization, in a hierarchy, or in a committee. And so they might not be the only decider. And
Right.
they've got to please the financial office and
Yep.
the HR office and the CEO. And so understanding their world, what does their map of influence or map of decision making look like? How are they feeling? When they present my proposition to the CEO, how are they going to feel? Am I giving him all the tools that he needs to have or she needs to have to present? So it's still the same principle, understanding the individual and their sentiments, but you got to be in their world. You got to live in their world. I used to live in Mom's house. That was how we got data.
Yeah.
You've got to live in their office and their world.
Yeah. Very good. Very good. So the podcast is at Mises.org, but also available iTunes, I imagine, Stitcher,
Yeah, it's on all
of
the
those.
podcast platforms. So search for Economics for Entrepreneurs, and then at Mises.org/E4E pod. So we in a modern way, we took Economics for Entrepreneurs as the letter E, the number 4, the letter E, POD,
All
E4E
right.
pod. And let me also mention that if you go to hunterhastings.com, we've got all of the podcasts laid out in a very easy form. And let me also add, if I may, that
Of course.
with every podcast, we try to add something of value. We've always got a free downloadable PDF, which might be a checklist, it might be a guide, it might be a process map, it might be, we had Mark Schaefer on, who talks about human-centered marketing. He's a very interesting guy. He said this digital marketing is making us all not think about human beings. We think about clicks, and we think about what we call engagement, which is I send you an email and you reply to it. That's engagement. It's not. We're annoying the hell out of people because we've forgotten the human part of it. And again, we match that to Austrian economics, subjective value. And he has a human-centered marketing manifesto. It's a 10-point list of how to think when you're marketing. And so those are the kinds of things that are available free with the podcast.
Okay, so hunterhastings.com. All right. Well, Hunter, thank you very much for coming in.
Good. Thank you, Albert. This was wonderful. Thank you very much.